before the fires, before the freedom songs rode the wind, there was Saint-Domingue, an island wrapped in sugar and sorrow. In the late 1700s, it was the richest colony in the French Empire, supplying nearly half the world's sugar and much of its coffee. Towering palms swayed over endless fields of cane, and colonial mansions gleamed in the sun. But behind the wealth was a machine of torment. Nearly 500,000 enslaved Africans worked in brutal heat, watched by overseers armed with whips and rifles. By night, their backs bled. By day, their hands bled. Their suffering built empires, but their voices were stilled. In the port city of Cap Francais, merchant ships crowded the harbors, unloading goods and loading barrels of sugar soaked with blood. The French elite lived in opulence, surrounded by imported silks and fine wines, even as death rates among enslaved workers climbed with each harvest. Disease, exhaustion, and cruelty made Saint-Domingue a colony where most did not live long enough to grow old. But beneath the weight of this cruelty, something endured: language, rhythm, memory. In whispers and in song, in rituals passed under moonlight, the enslaved preserved a sense of identity that slavery had tried to strip away. The social structure of the colony was sharp and unforgiving. At the top were wealthy white planters, then poorer whites, many resentful and ambitious. Below them stood the gens de couleur libres, free people of color, some of whom owned land, wealth, and even slaves themselves, while still being denied equal rights. And below all stood the enslaved majority, whose lives were dictated by the Code Noir, a set of brutal colonial laws. This structure was volatile, and tensions simmered everywhere. Each group harbored deep resentments. The soil was fertile, not just for sugar, but for revolution. Every plantation had its own silent battle. Resistance took many forms: runaways who vanished into the mountains, workers who broke tools or slowed production, mothers who passed down forbidden songs. Though the whip cracked louder than any voice, rebellion lived in quiet places, in the way a field hand looked at stars, or the way an elder remembered Africa with tears and fire in their eyes. Generations had passed in bondage, but none forgot the feeling of freedom. And when the time came, they would answer the call. As night fell over Saint-Domingue, the island exhaled. The wind carried scents of rum and sea salt, but also sweat and blood. The stars looked down on a powder keg. No empire lasts forever, not even one fed by sugar. Beneath the tranquil surface, something stirred. The world believed Saint-Domingue belonged to France, but the enslaved knew otherwise. They had no maps, no rights, no armies, only memory, fire, and the night wind. And in that wind, revolution already whispered. By the 1780s, Saint-Domingue was bursting at its seams, not from expansion, but from pressure. Each layer of colonial society resented the others, and no one felt secure. The white elite feared the sheer number of enslaved people, outnumbering them nearly 10 to 1. They built their fortunes on this imbalance, but knew it could not hold. Meanwhile, poor whites denied the privileges of their wealthier counterparts, seethed with envy. Free people of color, many well-educated and land-owning, were furious at being barred from the rights of citizenship. Everyone was watching everyone else, and everywhere was fear. The Code Noir, France's decree governing slavery, was brutal in its intent and impossible in its enforcement. It laid out punishments for disobedient slaves and rules for their treatment. But in practice, cruelty reigned unchecked. Planters beat, mutilated, and killed with impunity. But the same code also denied full citizenship to free people of color, no matter their wealth or education. This created a paradox. A man could own land, even slaves, and still be denied the right to vote or wear a sword. The free black and mixed-race population became a powder keg unto itself. Among the enslaved, stories passed in whispers, tales of maroon communities hidden in the mountains, of poisoned masters, of planned escapes. Many still remembered Africa, the rhythms, the gods, the dignity. Others had been born into bondage but knew freedom as an idea, a song sung softly at night or a mother's lullaby. They watched the masters carefully. They memorized routes through the jungle. They listened to the growing discord among the whites. They waited, and in waiting, they gathered strength. Outside forces only worsened the tension. British and Spanish interests eyed Saint-Domingue greedily, and smugglers slipped through the coastline, spreading rumors and stirring instability. Meanwhile, across the sea, France was cracking under its own weight. The Estates General met in 1789, and cries of liberté, égalité, fraternité began echoing through the Atlantic. What did those words mean to people born in chains? To those denied rights because of skin color? The answer would come soon. But in Saint-Domingue, revolution was not just inspired. It was inevitable. The island was no longer still. You could feel it in the air, in the way conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned, in the way overseers checked their pistols twice before bed. Everyone felt something coming, though no one could name it. But in the night wind, there were signs. Drums in the distance, dogs barking at nothing, the flicker of movement at the edge of the cane fields. Those who ruled Saint-Domingue had grown fat on fear, but they had forgotten what fear becomes when it has nothing left to lose. Across the Atlantic, the French Revolution had erupted like a storm. Crowds in Paris tore down the Bastille in 1789, and the monarchy began to crumble. Ideas of liberty, equality, and brotherhood flooded the streets, and soon they crossed the ocean. In Saint-Domingue, they arrived not as ideals, but as questions. If all men were born free, why were hundreds of thousands still shackled in sugarcane fields? If the rights of man were universal, why were people of color denied theirs? The island's social hierarchy began to fracture, not from above or below, but from all sides at once. The white colonists, especially the wealthy planters, were divided in their loyalties. Some supported the new French Republic, hoping for economic reforms. Others leaned toward independence, fearing abolitionist sentiments coming from Paris. Still others began to reach out to Britain or Spain, hoping to align with powers that might help preserve slavery. Meanwhile, free people of color took up a language of revolution to demand equal rights. They wrote letters to the French Assembly, organized militias, and took to the courts. The colonial world they lived in had grown too tight, and revolution gave them room to push. But the enslaved saw more than just papers and politics. They saw movement, discontent, a shifting of power, and through secret networks, they learned the names of those in France who fought for emancipation. They heard that slavery had been challenged in other parts of the empire. Most of all, they felt momentum building. Revolution was not merely observed. It was felt in the gut, in the deep woods and back quarters of plantations. Drums began to echo again. Calls went out. Eyes turned toward the mountains. Hope had become action. Meanwhile, emissaries from revolutionary France arrived in the colony with promises and contradictions. The National Assembly granted political rights to some free men of color, but not all. Debates raged in Paris while the island boiled. Riots broke out in Cap Français. Militia units clashed. There were battles not just between races, but within them, between radicals and conservatives, loyalists and rebels. Saint-Domingue was becoming ungovernable, a place where colonial law had lost its grip, and the people, all of them, were preparing for something beyond law, uprising. And still the plantation stood. The sugar was harvested. The ship sailed. But it was an illusion, a dream rapidly fraying. Beneath the silence of colonial order, the drums were louder now. The fire was closer. Each day brought more signs. A tool found sharpened like a blade. A guard found missing. A rumor of a mass escape. Revolution didn't arrive with fanfare. It crept through the cane, moved with the wind, and prepared in the dark. The question was no longer if something would happen. It was when. It came with fire. On the night of August 21st, 1791, the enslaved rose up across the northern plains of Saint-Domingue. Cane fields blazed under a black sky. Mansions were set alight. Torches cut through the dark like swords, and the wind carried the screams of masters and the war cries of rebels. It wasn't chaos. It was coordinated. Thousands moved as if called by a single pulse. Years of pain and quiet planning had led to this moment. The night of fire had begun, and the world would never see the island the same way again. In villages and plantations across the countryside, enslaved men and women who had lived in silence took up arms, machetes, farming tools, anything that could cut or burn. Their targets were not only overseers and owners, but the very structures of slavery. Storage houses, sugar mills, chains. Fires lit the sky for days, and the rebellion spread with breathtaking speed. The colonial militias were caught off guard. This wasn't a riot, it was a war. Entire regions of the north fell to rebel control within a week. The earth itself seemed to reject bondage. The revolution's first leaders were men like Boukman Dutty, a Vodou priest of Jamaican origin whose call for insurrection ignited the uprising. Days before the revolt, at a secret ceremony in the forest of Bois Cayman, he is said to have invoked the spirits, calling upon the enslaved to strike together in the name of freedom. Myth and truth entwine around that night, but what's certain is that belief fueled the blade. Vodou was more than religion. It was a bond, a language of resistance, and a compass for the oppressed. The colonial government panicked. They demanded reinforcements from France and called in the local militias. But many of the white population fled inland or to the coast. Some plantation owners begged for mercy. Others died with whips still in hand. Free people of color were caught in a dangerous position. Some tried to protect their communities, while others joined the revolt or were targeted as symbols of the system. The island was unraveling, and at its center, the enslaved, long dismissed as property, were now the authors of history. But rebellion was only the beginning. Many of the leaders knew this fire could not burn forever, without direction. The question was no longer how to rise. It was what comes next. Some rebel factions wanted vengeance. Others sought negotiation. A few dreamed of complete independence. In the hills and forests, strategies were drawn, alliances considered. They had broken the chains. Now came the hard part, staying free. And as the embers glowed in the cane fields, the night wind carried both victory and uncertainty. At the heart of the revolution was spirit, a force not only political, but deeply spiritual. Vodou ceremonies, long suppressed by colonial rule, had become rallying points. At Bois Cayman, rebels didn't just plan tactics, they summoned strength. The spirits, the Wa, were guardians and guides. In the absence of freedom, Vodou provided structure, memory, and fire. It was a reclamation of African identity and unity, binding people from different tribes and languages. Chanting, drumming, and dancing were not just rituals, they were declarations. We are still here, and we will no longer bow. The French viewed Vodou with fear, branding it sorcery, rebellion, and madness. But for the enslaved, it was survival. The spiritual world became a battlefield where freedom was prayed for, fought for, and blessed. The ancestors, evoked by drumming and possession, reminded the people of who they were before the ships came. Songs in Fon, Congo, Yoruba, languages that had been forbidden, flowed again. In the face of brutal dehumanization, Vodou returned humanity. It said, "We are not beasts. We are warriors, mothers, poets, kings." Boukman Dudi, the fiery priest of Bois Cayman, became a legend. His words, preserved in whispers, called upon the God of the oppressed to listen to the voice of liberty. After the uprising began, he led with fire in hand and vision in heart. Though he was killed early in the revolt, the French decapitated him and displayed his head in Cap Francais, hoping to kill the rebellion by killing its prophet. But they misunderstood. The revolution had never been one man. It was a flame passed from hand to hand. After Boukman's death, the movement did not falter. Leaders began to rise among the ranks of former slaves and maroons. They were organized, disciplined, and deeply connected to both the spiritual and the practical. Camps in the hills became training grounds. Messages were carried in songs and coded words. Vodou, far from being chaotic, had become a network. Resistance, both spiritual and physical, was now part of daily life. It was not just a battle, it was a way of being. And so, under moonlight and storm, the revolution found its rhythm. Drums beat like a heartbeat across the island, sinking distant villages and mountain camps. Freedom was not declared in newspapers. It was danced in ritual, shouted in ceremonies, carved into the bark of trees. Saint-Domingue had become something new, a place where spirit and rebellion walked hand in hand. And as the colonizers grew more afraid, the rebels grew more united. The fire had started in fields, but now it burned in every soul. Among the shifting alliances and burning fields, a new name began to surface: Toussaint Louverture. Born into slavery around 1743, Toussaint had been freed by his master and educated, a rarity in a world that denied the humanity of black men. He read French philosophers, studied medicine, and worked as a coachman before the uprising. But as the revolution ignited, he emerged from the shadows not merely as a fighter, but as a strategist, a diplomat, and a visionary. While others burned, Toussaint planned. While chaos reigned, he moved like wind between forces, building something larger than rebellion. Toussaint didn't rush to join the rebellion in its early days. He waited, he observed, And then, when leaders fell or floundered, he stepped forward with clarity. Fluent in French and skilled in negotiation, he formed alliances, sometimes with the Spanish, sometimes with rebel factions, using each move to strengthen the cause of emancipation. But Toussaint was not just clever. He was deeply committed to a dream, not only ending slavery, but building a stable, black-led society. In a world that believed such a thing impossible, he dared to imagine it. On the battlefield, Toussaint was unlike anyone the French had faced. He embraced guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, mountain ambushes, sabotage. His men, many of them former slaves, knew the land better than any soldier. They moved silently through cane and forest, striking quickly and vanishing. Under Toussaint, they became a disciplined force. He enforced order, banned looting, and demanded respect from his troops. His leadership was not fueled by revenge, but by purpose. Each village liberated, each plantation seized, was a step towards something more enduring than war, a nation. But Toussaint's war was fought not only with muskets, it was also political. He wrote letters to French officials, to British envoys, even to the American government, pleading the cause of freedom and presenting himself as a reasonable, moral leader. He knew the power of perception. He styled himself not as a destroyer, but as a protector of order. In a world terrified of black revolution, Toussaint offered something new, the image of a black general who could govern as well as fight. This, in many ways, made him more dangerous than fire. Toussaint Louverture had no blueprint. He walked a path no one had cleared before him. Each decision was a gamble. But with every plantation reclaimed and law imposed, he shaped Saint-Domingue into something closer to his vision. Not just free, but organized. Not just revolutionary, but enduring. The colonists had believed slaves could not rule themselves. Toussaint was proving them wrong. One decree, one field, one victory at a time. And though storms still lay ahead, he had already changed history with a steady, unstoppable force of wind through fire. The hills of Saint-Domingue became more than sanctuary. They became strongholds of revolution. Toussaint's forces knew every bend in the river, every narrow pass through the forest, every hidden trail between plantations. Using these advantages, they waged a war of movement. The French, trained in European-style open-field combat, struggled in the Caribbean terrain. Columns of redcoats or Republican infantry would march into the jungle and vanish, ambushed by fighters who struck like thunder and disappeared into the trees. The land itself fought alongside the rebels, turning every mountain into a fortress. Beyond the battlefields, communication was key. Toussaint established a vast intelligence network, relying on couriers, sympathetic priests, and freed slaves to carry messages between units. In an age before radios, it was rhythm and memory that kept the revolution moving. Coded songs, hidden messages in church hymns, even symbols drawn on trees. With each raid or victory, morale grew stronger. They weren't just surviving, they were building. Makeshift encampments turned into villages. Former slaves took on leadership roles. The revolution was not just dismantling slavery, it was constructing an entirely new society. European forces were further weakened by the tropical climate. Disease, particularly yellow fever, ravaged armies unaccustomed to the heat and humidity. What bullets and blades didn't kill, mosquitoes often did. French and Spanish commanders watched their numbers dwindle not just from skirmishes, but from silent fever deaths in tents and forts. Meanwhile, the rebels, native to climate and hardened by a lifetime of toil, endured. In a war of attrition, it was not just strength, but resilience that determined victory. And no one was more resilient than those who had survived generations of chains. Despite hardships, Toussaint knew the revolution needed structure. He issued proclamations urging discipline, order, and protection for civilians. Looting and revenge killings were forbidden under his command. While some factions still acted with fury, Toussaint's core forces aimed for legitimacy. He reopened plantations, but paid workers a wage. He rebuilt roads and reopened schools. His goal wasn't just freedom. It was to prove that formerly enslaved people could lead a nation. And while European empires sneered, the seeds of a new Haiti began to take root in ashes. Every night, the island echoed with rhythm. Drums in the mountains, songs in the cane fields, boots in the jungle. These sounds were not echoes of slavery, but of transformation. Guerrilla warfare had reshaped the island's geography, turning every path into a possibility. The French called it rebellion. The rebels called it justice. And as the wind moved across the highlands and swept over the smoldering lowlands, it carried a message too quiet for the empire to hear. We are winning. As the revolution deepened, diplomacy became just as critical as the battlefield. Toussaint Louverture, now firmly in command of the rebellion's northern front, understood that victory required more than bullets. It required recognition. In 1793, he made a calculated move, an alliance with the Spanish, who controlled the eastern part of the island. They promised him weapons and support in exchange for his rebellion against the French Republic. It was a bold maneuver, turning one imperial power against another while strengthening the rebels' position with crucial supplies. At the same time, France's internal revolution had taken a radical turn. The Jacobins, led by Robespierre, had seized control and declared a commitment to liberty and equality. In a stunning move in 1794, the French National Convention abolished slavery throughout its colonies. For the first time in modern history, a major European power had officially recognized the freedom of formerly enslaved people. This seismic decision changed the political landscape entirely, and Toussaint responded with equal boldness. He severed ties with the Spanish and offered his loyalty to France. This switch in allegiance was more than political, it was strategic. Toussaint understood that aligning with revolutionary France gave his movement legitimacy. He rejoined the French army, now as a general, and brought with him thousands of well-trained, battle-hardened black soldiers. The tide of war turned quickly. Toussaint and his allies began driving the Spanish out of the colony. Then, with equal determination, they faced down British forces who had invaded the island's coast, hoping to exploit the chaos. By 1798, the British had suffered massive losses and withdrew. As his military victories mounted, Toussaint began to reshape Saint-Domingue into a functioning society. He issued a constitution, abolished racial discrimination, and called for unity among all citizens, black, white, and mixed. While plantations reopened under strict military supervision, wages were paid and the whip outlawed. Toussaint insisted on discipline, industry, and order. He envisioned a prosperous black republic, rooted in Enlightenment ideals, but crafted to the unique fire of the Caribbean. His dream was not vengeance. It was structure, dignity, and peace through strength. But peace was fragile. France was shifting again. Robespierre had fallen, and a new leader was rising, Napoleon Bonaparte. Toussaint knew the tides of Europe could not be trusted. His reforms were bold, but they risked angering both former colonists and powerful generals in Paris. Still, he pressed forward, believing that a balance could be struck between independence and diplomacy. In his quietest moments, standing at dusk over the fields once watered with blood, Toussaint watched the stars and wondered, would France honor its promise, or would the winds of empire return? With the withdrawal of British forces and the retreat of the Spanish, Toussaint Louverture stood as the uncontested leader of Saint-Domingue. Though nominally loyal to France, he acted independently, issuing proclamations, appointing officials, and even negotiating trade with foreign powers like the United States and Great Britain. His goal was pragmatic: secure the island's economy and maintain order. Exports resumed, mostly sugar and coffee, in the fields, once battlegrounds, were now dotted with laborers working for wages. To the outside world, it looked like peace, but it was a peace carved from vigilance and discipline. Toussaint's rule was strict. He knew that to prevent Saint-Domingue from sliding back into chaos, he needed order, perhaps even more than liberty. He enforced military discipline across the countryside and required former slaves to keep working the plantations, now as free laborers. To many, especially those who had once been enslaved, this felt like a betrayal. Was this truly freedom if the same fields had to be tended, just under different rules? But Toussaint believed industry was survival. Without exports, the colony would starve, and France would return with vengeance. His reforms reached into all corners of life. Schools were open for black children, something unthinkable under French rule. Churches reopened with local clergy, and laws were passed guaranteeing civil rights for all races. He banned racial distinctions from legal documents and demanded that all be referred to as citizens. For the first time, Saint-Domingue resembled the ideals of the Enlightenment, but in the salons of Paris, white colonists whispered with fury. They had lost their wealth, their power, and a black man now stood at the center of it all. Then came the Constitution of 1801, Toussaint's most daring move. It declared him governor for life and Saint-Domingue as autonomous, still linked to France, but free to govern itself. It banned slavery permanently, outlawed racial hierarchy, and claimed all men as equal under law. The Constitution did not explicitly declare independence, but to Napoleon Bonaparte, it might as well have. Toussaint had crossed a line. In France, plans began to form. Saint-Domingue would be retaken, slavery would be restored, and the empire would return, this time with fire and vengeance. Toussaint had expected this. In private letters, he warned his generals to prepare. Forts were repaired, supplies stored, militias trained in the hills. The people, weary but proud, braced themselves. They had tasted liberty, and no empire would take it back without a fight. The drums began again, not of ritual, but of readiness. In quiet homes and misty mountains, families whispered prayers and sharpened blades. Toussaint looked once more to the sea, knowing what came would be terrible, but he had survived worse and built hope from ashes. In early 1802, the storm arrived. Napoleon Bonaparte, determined to restore France's colonial wealth, dispatched his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with over 20,000 troops and a clear mission: reassert control over Saint-Domingue, remove Toussaint Louverture, and if necessary, reinstate slavery. The fleet filled the horizon, sleek warships bristling with cannons, carrying soldiers hardened by European battles. For the first time in years, the revolution faced an enemy backed by the full power of an empire. But Saint-Domingue was no longer a colony of slaves. It was a land of warriors. Leclerc arrived under a false banner of peace, claiming to uphold the abolition of slavery and work with Toussaint. But behind the promises lay betrayal. Toussaint, cautious but unwilling to provoke unnecessary war, agreed to parley. There were uneasy negotiations. For a brief moment, it appeared a fragile peace might hold. Yet, beneath the surface, both sides prepared for the inevitable. Toussaint fortified key regions, dispersed troops into the hills, and readied the countryside. Leclerc's orders were clear: arrest Toussaint and dismantle his regime. Soon, the truth was undeniable. French troops began seizing territory, dismantling black-led militias, and imprisoning former rebel commanders. Fighting erupted in cities and mountain passes. The people responded with fury. In every region, the memory of slavery lit their resolve like fire. Toussaint's generals, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, and others, rose with devastating force. Guerrilla tactics returned. Villages burned to deny resources to the French, and jungle paths became killing grounds. The French, expecting surrender, now faced a war fiercer than any they had imagined. In the midst of this chaos, betrayal struck. French agents captured Toussaint under the guise of renewed negotiations. He was seized and quietly placed aboard a ship bound for France. As the ship departed, the people mourned, but they did not falter. Toussaint, defiant even in chains, is said to have warned his captors: "In overthrowing me, you'll cut down only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again by the roots, for they are many and deep." His absence became legend. His revolution lived on. Toussaint was gone, but the revolution was leaderless no longer. His generals took up his mantle, fiercer and more radical than before. They no longer trusted words, treaties, or flags. What remained was fire and a vow. Slavery would never return, not on this soil. In villages and strongholds, the people picked up arms again. The spirit of resistance had changed, no longer cautious, but resolute. The empire had made its choice. And now, the people of Saint-Domingue would make theirs. Toussaint Louverture's capture ignited a new and more brutal phase of the revolution. Without their leader, the people of Saint-Domingue did not waver. Instead, they burned with resolve. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, once Toussaint's trusted general, now led the resistance. If Toussaint had been a master strategist and diplomat, Dessalines was fire incarnate. He was ruthless, passionate, and utterly committed to breaking the chains once and for all. Under his leadership, the war took on a terrifying clarity. This was no longer about negotiation. It was a fight for existence. France, in its desperation, revealed its true intentions. Despite earlier promises, Leclerc's forces began to restore slavery in territories under their control. Former slaves were chained again, plantation systems reimposed, and families torn apart. Word of these atrocities spread like wildfire. The people of Saint-Domingue realized there would be no peace. only submission or resistance. Thousands who had once laid down arms picked them up again. Forests became battlefields, sugarcane fields ran red, and even children carried news, weapons, or supplies across enemy lines. The war became total. Nature turned against the French. Yellow fever returned with deadly precision, sweeping through the ranks. The European soldiers, unaccustomed to the Caribbean climate, fell in staggering numbers. Leclerc himself succumbed to illness in late 1802. His replacement, General Rochambeau, took command, and with him came terror. He unleashed massacres, drowned prisoners at sea, and used bloodhounds imported from Cuba to hunt down rebels. But every cruelty strengthened the rebels' resolve. Saint-Domingue was no longer merely a colony. It was a crucible, forging something indestructible through fire and suffering. By early 1803, the rebellion had transformed into a war of annihilation. The people of Saint-Domingue, led by Dessalines, Christophe, and others, began driving the French into the sea. One by one, cities fell. Bridges were destroyed, ports blocked, supply lines severed. White soldiers who had once marched with arrogance now ran from burning garrisons or begged for evacuation. The final battles were brutal, but the tide had turned for good. What began as a slave revolt had become something history had never seen, a victorious uprising against empire. By November 1803, the French defeat was complete. At the Battle of Verdières, the rebels dealt the final blow. The last remnants of the French army surrendered. Napoleon, facing wars in Europe and an empire unraveling, abandoned his dream of reclaiming the colony. Saint-Domingue, once the jewel of the French Empire, now stood free, at an unimaginable cost, but with unbreakable pride. The world watched in disbelief. A revolution led by the enslaved had defeated the most powerful empire of its day. Something truly new had been born. With the final defeat of the French, a breathless silence fell over Saint-Domingue. But it was not peace, it was anticipation. The people, scarred and weary, stood on the edge of something unimaginable. The birth of first free black republic in the modern world. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, hardened by years of brutal war, declared independence on January 1st, 1804. He renamed the land Haiti, honoring the island's original Taino name. In this single act, he broke not just from France, but from centuries of colonial domination. The world shifted. Haiti's Declaration of Independence was not just a political document. It was a cry of justice. Dessalines wrote that we must live free or die. The horrors of slavery were too fresh, the wounds too deep to risk ever returning to empire. Many white settlers had already fled. Those who remained faced severe retribution. Dessalines ordered massacres of remaining French residents, seeing them as threats to the fragile peace. It was a dark chapter, and to some, a stain. But to Dessalines, it was a final severing of the chains. Internationally, the reaction to Haiti's independence was swift and cold. The United States, Britain, and other European powers feared the spread of slave revolts. They refused to recognize a new nation, imposed trade embargoes, and isolated it diplomatically. Haiti was alone, economically devastated, politically shunned, and forced to defend its existence from the moment it was born. Yet even in isolation, it stood. It stood for liberty, for dignity, and for the idea that even the most oppressed people could write their own destiny. Dessalines crowned himself Emperor Jacques I. His reign was brief and harsh, marked by attempts to rebuild the economy and unify a deeply scarred population. He emphasized agriculture and militarization, hoping to protect Haiti from external threats and internal collapse. But discontent grew. Some former allies turned against him. In 1806, just 2 years after independence, Dessalines was assassinated by his own officers. The revolution's fiercest flame was extinguished, but the fire he lit would never go out. Haiti had been born in blood, and it would endure in struggle. Despite its fractured beginnings, Haiti stood as a monument to what humanity could achieve against impossible odds. It proved that history could be rewritten, not by kings or empires, but by the will of the enslaved, the vision of leaders like Toussaint and Dessalines, and the fire that no chain could extinguish. As night sailed across the Caribbean and wind whispered to the cane fields once stained with blood, a new story took root in the soil. Haiti was free, and it would remain so no matter the cost. The birth of Haiti echoed like thunder through the Atlantic world. In the American South, enslavers panicked, fearing a similar uprising. In France, Napoleon buried his Caribbean ambitions and turned instead toward continental conquest. Across Latin America, whispers of revolution stirred. Haiti, tiny and alone, became a symbol of possibility and a source of fear. But within the nation itself, there was no time for reflection. The work of survival continued. The new Haitian government struggled to build institutions, feed its people, and protect against looming threats from abroad. After Dessalines' assassination, Haiti split into rival regions. In the north, Henri Christophe declared himself king and ruled with rigid order, building palaces and fortresses like the Grand Citadel La Ferrière. In the south, Alexander Pétion established a republic with more liberal principles. The division fractured the country, but both leaders, despite differences, shared a core mission: preserve freedom. The shadow of France still loomed. Every decision was made with caution. Every alliance weighed against the danger of foreign intervention. In their own ways, both Christophe and Pétion worked to uphold the revolution's legacy. The economy remained a critical challenge. With trade embargoes and limited access to credit, Haiti struggled to export its goods. Foreign merchants demanded harsh terms, and former colonial powers refused to deal fairly with a nation of black leaders. In 1825, under threat of invasion, France demanded Haiti pay reparations for lost property, including enslaved people. The Haitian government, desperate for peace and trade, agreed. The debt was enormous and crippled the country's economy for generations. Though the revolution had broken chains, its price would linger painfully for centuries. Even under hardship, Haiti became a sanctuary. Refugees from other revolutions, freedmen, sailors, and political exiles found safety on its shores. Haiti supported independence movements in Latin America, offering shelter to Simón Bolívar and others. Though the young nation faced hunger and political discord, it never abandoned its identity as a beacon of liberty. Haitian diplomats traveled abroad with dignity, reminding the world that freedom, once claimed, would not be surrendered. Haiti had earned its independence not through permission of empire, but through fire, will, and blood. The legacy of the Haitian Revolution is immense. It redefined what was possible. It proved that liberation could be seized by the oppressed, even against overwhelming force. Haiti's story is not just one of tragedy and resilience. It is a testament to the enduring power of hope, unity, and refusal to accept injustice. As the wind rustles through the sugarcane and moonlight dances on the stone walls of ruined plantations, Haiti sleeps. But spirit does not. It watches, it remembers, and it teaches still. Though the revolution had succeeded in freeing the people of Haiti, the scars it left behind were deep and lasting. Families have been broken, entire villages erased, and generations marked by violence. In the years that followed independence, rebuilding was slow and painful. Much of the infrastructure had been destroyed. Bridges, roads, and irrigation systems lay in ruins. Education was limited, healthcare almost non-existent. Yet amid the hardship, communities found ways to survive. Faith, music, and memory became tools of endurance. Voodoo ceremonies returned to open spaces, offering healing and connection to ancestors who had fought and fallen. Art and storytelling flourished as a way to preserve the revolution's memory. Griots, or oral historians, traveled between towns, recounting the tales of Toussaint, Dessalines, and the brave women and men who had faced cannons with machetes. Paintings with carvings and embroidered flags depicted scenes of battle, freedom, and unity. These weren't just art, they were living testaments. They reminded every child growing up in Haiti that their freedom had been fought for and won, not granted. In this way, the revolution never ended. It lived on through the culture and soul of the people. Still, political unity remained elusive. After Dessalines' death, power struggles and regional conflicts plagued the young nation. Henri Christophe's northern monarchy eventually collapsed, and Pétion's southern republic transitioned through several unstable regimes. Coups, foreign interference, and economic isolation continued to strangle progress. Many Haitians emigrated, while others stayed and fought to improve their homeland. Despite the turbulence, there remained a shared national identity rooted in the revolution, the pride of being the world's first free black republic, and the knowledge that no colonial master could ever return. Throughout the 19th century, Haiti became a haven for other revolutionaries and freed people. Black families from the United States, escaping slavery and discrimination, immigrated to Haiti in search of safety and dignity. Latin American freedom fighters found refuge and support from Haitian leaders. Though its own path was difficult, Haiti extended its hand to others. The spirit of the revolution transcended borders. It said, "Freedom is not a gift. It is a right, and those who claim it must protect and share with others in need." And so, as generations passed, Haiti remained both wounded and proud. The revolution had forged a people who refused to be conquered, not by force, not by poverty, and not by the bitterness of the world's rejection. In every village song and prayer, the names of the fallen are whispered like sacred words. Toussaint, Dessalines, Christophe, Marie-Jean. They live not in the past, but in the breath of every free Haitian. And under the moonlit sky, where the winds rustle through cane fields once soaked in blood, they still stand guard. By the late 1800s, Haiti was still navigating a complex web of internal challenges and external pressures. Though independence had been won decades earlier, the cost of that freedom was still being paid, both financially and politically. The massive reparations to France had bankrupted the economy, forcing the government to take out foreign loans that only deepened dependency. Meanwhile, global racism and white-dominated colonial powers refused to treat Haiti as an equal. Yet despite this global hostility, the Haitian people clung fiercely to their independence, their culture, and their revolutionary spirit. Education became a quiet battleground. Though early leaders had tried to build schools and promote literacy, resources remained scarce. Only the wealthiest families could afford private education, and many rural communities were left behind. However, the oral traditions continued to thrive. Grandparents taught grandchildren about a revolution by firelight, passing on songs, proverbs, and stories not found in books. In this way, Haitian history was not just taught in classrooms. It lived in courtyards, kitchens, and church pews. The flame of identity was kept alive by voices, not ink. Internationally, Haiti's example continued to resonate. In the United States, abolitionists looked to Haiti as proof that formerly enslaved people could lead themselves and create nations. Frederick Douglass famously praised Haiti, declaring it a beacon of hope and demanding it be respected by the world. Yet, that respect was slow in coming. Haiti's isolation remained a strategic tool for colonial powers, hoping to keep the example from spreading. They feared that what Haiti had done, toppling slavery and empire, might inspire others to follow suit. Domestically, politics continued to cycle between hope and upheaval. Haiti saw multiple constitutions, presidents, coups, and counter-coups. Power often shifted by force rather than vote, and distrust of government remained high. Yet even in these stormy times, people found ways to build lives. Markets reopened, harvests returned, and festivals filled the streets with drumming and dancing. The revolution had given Haitians not just freedom, but pride. They were not merely survivors. They were inheritors of a mighty legacy, one carved out by fire and held in callous hands. As the 19th century came to a close, Haiti stood alone but unbroken. No matter the poverty, no matter the foreign threats, its people refused to forget who they were. The revolution had not made life easy. It had made it theirs. And on star-filled nights, when the drums echoed in the hills and the wind carried the scent of jasmine and ash, Haitians could still feel the presence of Toussaint, Dessalines, and the nameless millions who had fought for this land. Their spirits walked the soil and would never leave it. As Haiti entered the 20th century, it did so bearing the weight of both glory and sorrow. It had outlived empires and dictators, yet remained trapped in cycles of poverty and political instability. While its people remained fiercely independent, they faced growing international pressure, particularly from the United States, whose influence in the Caribbean expanded steadily. American investors eyed Haitian land and banks with interest, and U.S. warships frequently visited the harbors, a reminder that new empires had replaced the old. The island's revolution had not freed it from the world's hunger. In 1915, after years of political assassinations and unrest, the United States invaded and began a military occupation of Haiti that would last nearly 2 decades. American forces claimed they were bringing order and stability, but to Haitians, it felt like a return to foreign rule. Roads and infrastructure were built, but often with forced labor. Political dissent was silenced, and the Haitian constitution was rewritten to allow foreign land ownership, something Dessalines had explicitly forbidden. Though some Haitians collaborated, many resisted through protests, strikes, and even armed rebellion. Charismatic rebel leaders like Charlemagne Perrault emerged to oppose the occupation. Perrault, a former military officer, led a guerrilla resistance known as the Cacos, hiding in the hills and ambushing American patrols. Though he was eventually betrayed and killed, his martyrdom became legend. His body, tied to a door and displayed publicly, only deepened the people's resolve. Songs were written in his honor. His face joined those of Toussaint and Dessalines in murals and monuments. The revolution was no longer a distant past. It was present, unfolding in every generation. The occupation ended in 1934, but Haiti emerged from it economically dependent and politically fragile. The following decades were marked by instability and inequality. The Duvalier dynasty, Francois Papa Doc Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude Baby Doc, would later rise, cloaking their brutal regimes in nationalist language and voodoo mysticism. Many hoped for strong leadership, but received repression. The Tante Macoutes, Duvalier's feared militia, silenced opposition with terror. Though they claimed the legacy of the revolution, they ruled through fear rather than freedom. Yet despite everything, the spirit of 1804 never vanished. It endured in protest chants, in the pride of school children reciting Toussaint's words, and in the defiance of artists painting revolutionaries with halos. Each time Haiti fell, it remembered how it had risen. That memory, rooted in fire, fed by blood, and carried in song, remained unbroken. Haiti had shown the world what liberation looked like, and though the chains now came in new forms, debt, occupation, corruption, they still broke, one by one, in the hands of the people who refused to forget. As the 20th century pressed on, Haiti's resilience became both a source of pride and a painful burden. The departure of the Duvalier in 1986 brought a wave of hope, as Haitians took to the streets to celebrate the fall of dictatorship. But that hope was quickly tempered by chaos. Transitioning to democracy proved more difficult than expected. Coup after coup, election after election, the cycle repeated. Foreign powers returned, not as occupiers, but as helpers, often offering aid with strings attached. Yet the Haitian people remained deeply skeptical of outside influence, remembering too well the cost of intervention. In the 1990s, the election of Jean-Bertrand Aristide, a former priest and advocate for the poor, sparked a new kind of revolutionary optimism. His fiery speeches invoked the memory of Dessalines and called for justice and reform. But his time in office was turbulent. Aristide was overthrown in a coup, then returned, then forced into exile again. The cycle of disruption made it hard for institutions to take root. International peacekeepers came and went. Promises were made and broken. Still, the idea of democracy persisted like an ember in ashes. Natural disasters further tested Haiti's endurance. The 2010 earthquake was especially devastating. More than 200,000 lives lost in moments. Entire neighborhoods crumbled. Families disappeared beneath rubble. Aid flooded in, but so did corruption and confusion. The world watched, mourned, and then slowly looked away. Haitians, however, could not. They buried their dead, cleared the debris, and started over once more. Makeshift shelters became homes. Church hymns echoed from tent cities. The spirit of those who had once fought off slavery now lifted the living from under the weight of shattered stone. Culture became resistance. Haitian painters, poets, musicians, and filmmakers used their crafts to bear witness to injustice and keep the memory of the revolution alive. In schools, students still learn of 1804 with reverence. In public squares, statues of Dessalines and Toussaint stood battered but upright. Even in the poorest neighborhoods, people wore shirts with revolutionary slogans, flew the national flag, and prayed to both Christian saints and Buddhist spirits. Haiti's soul was not just historical. It was present, pulsing, and defiant. Even now, Haiti stands at a crossroads, battered, yes, but never bowed. The legacy of its revolution continues to shape every political act, every cultural expression, every prayer for a better future. To be Haitian is to carry history on your back and still rise to dance, to rebuild, to speak truth. In a world that often forgets or misunderstands a small, proud nation, the people of Haiti continue to whisper across generations. We were the first to be free, and we will never return to chains. Haiti's story in the 21st century is a continuation of the defiance it has always known. While the nation struggles with corruption, poverty, and political unrest, its people continue to fight for dignity. Protests are common, often erupting in the streets of Port-au-Prince with cries for justice, education, and food security. Youth lead many of these movements, waving flags with revolutionary pride. The slogans may have changed, but the fire behind them remains the same. The ghosts of Toussaint and Dessalines still march alongside the people, whispering that freedom must be defended every generation. Haiti's youth are not just resisting, they're creating. In art collectives, schools, and local tech hubs, they're imagining a new future. They code apps in French and Creole. They paint murals that blend ancient symbols with modern struggles. They film documentaries, record protest songs, and write poetry that resurrects the voices of the revolution. Even without proper resources, they craft tools of expression from what little they have. The revolution, once waged with machetes, is now fought with cameras, paintbrushes, and music. The spiritual resilience of the people remains a profound force. Voodoo, once demonized by colonizers and missionaries, is now being reclaimed as a sacred heritage. In ceremonies, drums beat out rhythms older than empire. Ancestral spirits are honored, their names called with reverence. Voodoo is not simply a religion, it is a language of memory and resistance. Alongside Christianity, it reminds Haitians that their identity is rooted not in conquest, but in survival, connection, and the land itself. Education continues to be both a struggle and a hope. Teachers work long hours for little pay, often without textbooks or electricity. Yet in these difficult conditions, students learn about the revolution, not just as history, but as fuel. They memorize Toussaint's words, learn Dessalines battles, and write essays imagining a brighter Haiti. For many children, school is more than a classroom. It is a sacred space where the future is still negotiable, where their ancestors' dreams live on in their notebooks. And at night, when the sky turns deep indigo and the power flickers off, families sit together under candlelight and remember. They speak of the old generals, the victories and betrayals, the dream of freedom that still burns. Parents tell their children, "We are the children of the first to rise." It is not nostalgia, it is duty. The revolution has no end date. It is an eternal story, woven into lullabies, passed down through prayer, and carried in the rhythm of the drums long after the fires go out. Haiti's presence on the world stage has always been paradoxical, at once celebrated and ignored. It was the first to break the chains of slavery, yet the global powers punished it for that defiance. Even today, the country is often portrayed solely through the lens of disaster and despair. But within Haiti, the people hold a different narrative. They see themselves as descendants of giants, Toussaint, Dessalines, Saint-Hilaire. This is not a country of victims. It is a land of survivors. And in the quiet hours of the night, that identity strengthens like iron in the dark. Diaspora communities have also carried Haiti's story abroad. In Brooklyn, Montreal, Paris, and Miami, Haitian immigrants have built neighborhoods filled with the sound of compa music, the taste of griot, and the language of both Creole and resistance. They raise their children with stories of the revolution, insisting that even far from home, they remain part of the legacy. Through remittances, activism, and art, the diaspora fuels hope back on the island. The borders of Haiti may be drawn in the Caribbean, but its heart beats around the globe. Haiti's role in global black history is profound and underacknowledged. The Haitian Revolution inspired uprisings in South America, alarmed slaveholders in the U.S., and even influenced global human rights discourse. Yet textbooks often omit this chapter. Still, scholars, poets, and activists continue to raise the banner of Haitian memory. Every February 7th and January 1st, every time Ayatollah New is whispered, the world is reminded. The modern struggle for black liberation began in the hills of Saint-Domingue, with fire in one hand and freedom in the other. Even in the face of ongoing political crises, the dream of a better Haiti refuses to die. Grassroots movements flourish. Farmers organize cooperatives. Women lead local councils. Teachers open informal schools beneath mango trees. In the cracks of corruption, seeds of progress are planted. They grow in silence, watered by memory and song. Change does not always come with fanfare. It comes like dusk, slowly and surely. And Haiti, more than most, understands that true revolution is not a moment, but a long and patient breath. So as the sun sets over the Caribbean once more, the land listens. The wind still moves through the cane fields like a whisper of prophecy. The drums still call out in rhythm. And the people, even when weary, remember who they are. Not the forgotten, not the broken, but the first to rise, the first to stand, the first to say no more. The revolution is not over. It lives in the quiet strength of every Haitian who dares to dream in darkness. In the hush of night, Haiti breathes history. From a moment enslaved men and women first whisper plans of rebellion beneath the full moon, the island has carried a legacy forged in courage. That legacy is not trapped in the past. It is alive in every heartbeat, every lullaby, every march. Though the world may reduce Haiti to headlines and statistics, those who truly listen can hear a deeper rhythm. The rhythm of defiance, of dignity, of a people who refuse to be broken even when the odds crush down like mountains. The revolution did not end in 1804. It simply changed form. It became resistance through art, through storytelling, through education. It lives in the woman selling mangoes who still prays to Esley for strength. It lives in the teacher who uses torn notebooks to speak of Dessalines. It lives in the father who names his daughter Sanite, reminding her every day that she comes from warriors. And it lives in the language itself, Creole, born from resistance, sharp with wit, warm with memory, fierce in its refusal to be silenced. Across generations, the struggle has not dimmed the joy. In fact, joy has become its own form of rebellion. Carnival erupts in brilliant color every year, a festival of dance, satire, and memory. Laughter spills into the streets. Songs carried through alleyways, and masks bear both humor and history. Even in poverty, Haitians find reason to celebrate, not as escape, but as endurance. To dance despite oppression is to say, we are still here. And in that declaration is a strength greater than any empire ever built. Sleep in Haiti does not come easily. It is filled with dreams and warnings, with the voices of ancestors and visions of change. In the silence after midnight, a rooster might crow, a drum might sound, a prayer might rise. These sounds are sacred. They link the living with the dead, the present with the past. They remind all who hear them that freedom is not guaranteed, but earned daily. That those who sleep under the stars tonight do so because someone long ago refused to kneel. And so, as this tale comes to rest like dust upon ancient stone, let it not be mistaken for an ending. This is a lullaby of struggle and survival, a quiet fire that still burns beneath the ashes. Haiti remains a land of revolution, of the first to stand and the last to surrender. Let it be known. No matter how far the night stretches, the dawn belongs to the brave. And in Haiti, the brave never sleep without dreaming of freedom,